Okay, what we've been talking about this week is kind of a continuation of the class that went before about map programs, where we put the public land survey map onto Google Maps and Google Earth. Well, we're going to do the same thing in a little bit of a modified fashion with what we call meets and bounds. So we're going to go into this and also talk a lot about the descriptions of the different programs. But one of the questions that came up almost initially was that why we would even be concerned about this. Why are we out trying to find out about maps? What's the relevance of legal descriptions? Why should we know this information when we're researching our ancestors? And so in order to give that sort of actual information, one of the major reasons, of course, is to identify and document our ancestors. And the reason that's an important factor is because we want to know what the true identity of our ancestors is. And secondly, we want to distinguish between individuals with the same or similar name. Here's one of the very most common things. In fact, this week, even the last week I've had questions come up from people about this problem. Problem comes up, they say, well, I have an ancestor and he has a very common name, and right there in the same geographic area at the same time as another person with the same or similar name. And people are always confusing them. On family tree, they're putting children in the wrong family because they think it's the same person, they've got the right person, and so they go back and forth with this. Well, basically, the only way to resolve that particular issue is to have very, very specific information about where these people lived. I can assure you that those people who are enrolling their kids in schools or who are taxing them in some way or people who are involved in fraternal organizations, nobody was getting them mixed up. In other words, it would happen if you got someone else's tax bill, you would probably realize that there was a problem and try to get it corrected. So those are the kinds of things that resolve when you focus in on the details. It's even more important in other areas where people have very common given and surnames, like in Scandinavian countries and Wales and other places that are known for having a very small pool of names, both given names and surnames. I ran into that this morning when I was doing some research on Find My Past. Came up with the record hints for my ancestor whose name is David Thomas, which is like the most common name you could find in the world in Wales, and had 4 wives suggested. Well, they were 4 different David Thomases. So unless you happen to know very specific details about this person, separating out which one would be your ancestor would be very, very difficult. So what we try to do is come down and identify as clearly as possible why, exactly who these people are, where they live. The next problem is identifying family members in the area. It's very important to understand that these people, most people did not move to a location in a vacuum. They went with family members, they were together as a group. If they immigrated from another country, from England or from Germany or from France or from wherever, then they would go to a place where the people spoke the same language or came from the same village or came from the same area of the country. So they all gathered in the United States into family and cultural and ethnic groups, and these groups are all interrelated. One of the questions I usually ask people is they're doing research and they say, well, I'm having difficulty finding this person. They usually say something like, I have a brick wall. Well, I say things like, I ask the question like, well, okay, well, who are their neighbors? And they go, neighbors? And I go, yeah, well, who lived next door? I don't know who lived next door. Why would I know that? They're not related to me. Well, how do you know that? How do you know they weren't living next door to their in-laws, or that they were living next door to the brother or the cousin or someone? So when you're doing these, when you're doing the research, we always expand, but without knowing the precise place where these people live, it's going to be more and more difficult to find the relatives who are in that area. It's very difficult. One research we were doing last Monday evening was a patron was asking a question about a family who lived in Tennessee. Well, the only location that they had was county. They had the county that they lived in, and when we did a search for the surname in that county, there were probably 50 or 100 people with that same surname in that county. Well, my guess is most of those people were related in some way. They're probably all descendants of the same original settler. But until it was really difficult separating out this ancestor, particularly because he seemed to go by 2 or 3 different names. So that was one of the limitations. Okay, so this is why we are looking at specific. The other reason is to find related records. That is, we want to be able to find records that are related directly to where a person lives. We'll talk about that a little bit in just a minute, of the kinds of records that we might look for. There's one basic thing that I mentioned when I started with this class on Monday and on Tuesday was my reference to the chain of title. Well, we need to understand what that is and how that can help us to understand and find our ancestors. What is the chain of title? It's a record of all of the previous recorded documents concerning transfers, deeds, liens, and easements affecting the title to a piece of real property. One of the common things that happens is that researchers will jump back. Okay, so they're doing research in the 1700s, and they pull up a deed because they found a deed record for their person. Well, they're immediately trying to read this deed, and they find out that it's very vague, and they can't figure out where these people lived. Well, the problem is you don't start back there. You start in the present, and you work your way back on the title until you find where your ancestor lived. It's kind of a chicken and the egg or cart before the horse problem. What you have to do is go back and forth trying to figure out the general geographic area, come to a more specific area, and once you find a specific location, begin to do the research to find the ownerships of that property. Sometimes it's easy. There's maps. There's all sorts of references, and that's what we're doing here. We're working through the process of identifying the exact property so that we can separate out between 2 people or find additional records or ancestors. Okay, so that's what this chain of title is. Generally that chain of title is located someplace. The records are kept, and the question is, where do you find the real property chain of title? First place you want to look is from the county and local websites. Throughout the United States, there is a very definite movement putting all of the recorded land records online, and in most cases, in many cases, making the original copies of the documents available. Now, that varies greatly from one county to the next. One county may have a completely computerized record search capability and show you the entire chain of title of a piece of property when you look it up, and another next county might not even have copies of the records online. So you may end up having to go to the county or to go to some other agency in order to find the records that are available. But generally, for instance, here in Utah County, we have a system where you can go online with the county assessor's office and click on and put in an address, and it will take you to the property. When you click on that property, you can see the complete chain of title. Everybody who bought that property from the origin. Somebody watching, they can come in if they want. You can invite them in. Okay. Anyway, so we have, so we can just go online to the county records. Basically, the two offices that you're going to look at are county assessors records or county recorders. Now, the assessors obviously are involved in taxing the property, so they're going to have tax records, but they will usually have an identifying number called a tax ID number, tax number, plat number, whatever, that identifies the property by that number that they use for taxing that particular piece of property. Now, when I start talking about this, there's sort of a general assumption that I found over the years that people think that this is somehow a modern development, that somehow or another, in the last whatever few years, we all of a sudden come up with this whole system of keeping track of property and taxation and recording the titles. Believe me, as long as there has been land, there have been people willing to tax it. And as long as they've been willing to tax it, they're making a record of those taxes. So you have been going back into the 15 and 1600s. Some of the more permanent records that we have are tax rolls. So you really need to understand that probably most of the records that are going to be of great value in determining who your ancestors are come from land-based records. Now, what we have in the United States is we have two things. We have title companies and abstracting companies. In the East, they're generally called title abstracts or abstracting companies, or generally attorneys are involved in that process. And they keep a record, or they research the record of the ownership of the property. In the West, they're done through title companies. The title companies will do a search on the ownership of the property. Now, why is this the case? Well, if you're buying a piece of real property and your ancestors bought property, they would like to know that what they bought was actually owned by the person that sold it. There may have been some defect in the deeds. There may have been some claims to the property. You don't want to buy a piece of property and end up buying a lawsuit. And so they needed to go to someone who could tell them that, yes, you have the right piece of property. And for a very, very long time in the United States, we've had a system of title insurance where private individuals were willing to guarantee that the title that you got was yours. Okay, so the question then is, where do they get their records? Well, ultimately, they have to look at the records that are recorded in the various recording locations, where the records are officially noted. Now, this is an interesting thing to understand. A lot of people don't get this. The problem is, for example, is a deed. In Arizona, as an example, is what we call a first-in-time, first-in-right state for deeds. If I were to give each of you a copy of a deed to my property, so I would sign a deed over to you and to you and to you and to you, each person got a deed. Who would own the property? The first person that gets to the courthouse and records that document is the owner. It's called a race to the courthouse. And that's a legal term. A race to the courthouse. The first person there who gets the document recorded is the actual owner of the property. And it's first in time, first in right. Now, that is not the case in all the states, and it's not the case in many other countries. In some cases, it's the date that the document is notarized. In some cases, it's the date it's signed. So there's all sorts of different ways of handling it, but in any event, in order for a deed to be valid as to the world, in opposed to between two people or two or more people, then that deed has to become public record. It has to be put someplace where anybody could go see that transaction took place. See, I could secretly sell property to you, but what if I then do that and then I want to do it again, so I sell the property to another person? There's got to be a mechanism based in the land business. There's a mechanism. Now, Arizona was interesting, and I bring that up because I was there for so long. We had a situation in western Arizona, along the. I'm going to get my whole thing mixed up. Western Arizona, along the Colorado River, they started a big project years and years ago. This is back in the early 60s, and late 60s and 70s. Of a thing called Lake Havasu Estates. And what they did with that was they created what apparently looked like postage stamp sheets of property, of lots. And then the developers sold those lots to people who had never seen them. And then they resold them to other people. And then they would mortgage them. Then they would sell mortgages. And then they would sell the mortgage, the secondary mortgages, and they would go through. Basically what happened is each one of these little small postage stamp lots could have as many as 5 or 6 or 7 different claimed owners. And they made millions and millions and millions of dollars off this subdivision, which never got developed. I don't know, but the last time I drove by there, there wasn't a house out there in that area where it had all been sold. So the problem, I mean, to avoid that kind of problem, then we have specific rules about how we show that people have ownership in property. And that's what all these records. Now, as they do these records, as they create these records, then those make them, they are available for us to research. Now, like I said, we can go online, it'd be very simple, and we can see all the information, or we may have to go sit in somebody's county assessor's office or into the recorder's office and actually go through the documents themselves. Generally, if they're going to go back and research property, people have made indexes to these records. They're usually called the grantor or grantee index. The person who sold the property, the grantor, or the person who bought the property, the grantee. So those are the records that we're going to be able to see. Okay, now what will we find if we do it? Well, as we go through this chain of title, we're going to find all sorts of documents. First would be executor deeds or administrator deeds. Executive or administrator deeds are deeds given by an estate to the heirs, either as an executor of a will or as administrator of an estate without a will, an intestate, probate. Okay, so if you're thinking about probate records, now probate records are extremely valuable for determining ages, people, identities, who are the members, former spouses, wives, all sorts of things. Okay. The problem is that most people will look at a death date or an approximate death date. They'll go into the recorders, into the court records, and they'll look around and they'll say, well, there was never probate. We couldn't find probate record. Well, the main reason for this is that a probate could be filed years after death. We had one I looked at recently that was filed like 7 to 10 years after the person died. And then the probate can go on forever. The last one we looked at in detail went on for 30 years before it closed. So we're still documents 40 years after the death of the deceased when that were being generated by this probate. So what are you going to do if you assume this person owned property? There's a tax roll that shows they own property, but the person dies, but you never see what happened to the property. Who got it? And you'd like to know who their children are, or you'd like to know who the wife's parents were, or somebody. Well, if you're going through the chain of real estate chain, then you find one of these deeds that gives you a date that you can start with. Instead of looking over 100 years of court records, you're going to have a date that shows you when that probate closed. You have a death date, so now you know when the documents were filed between those 2 dates. So that really guides you in finding the probate records. And we could go through lots of other kinds of records. That gives you the dates associated with the probates. What you might find also are disclaimer deeds. Historically, in the United States, when the wife got married, all of her property belonged to her husband. The husband was the sole owner of the marital community property. So, of the marital property. So we would have, so what happened if the husband sold the property? Well, the wife had what was called a dower interest. She may have a dower interest, depending on the state, or the wife's share of the probate. So if the husband sold the property and the wife didn't sign off on it or agree to it, then even after the husband died, the wife was able to go back and reverse that sale and get her interest out of the property. So in order to avoid that kind of an action, when the property was sold, then the wife had to sign a separate deed disclaiming her interest to the property. My most remote Tanner ancestor shows up in Rhode Island for the first time in 1680 as a witness to a disclaimer deed. We're talking 1680. So these are things that have happened and gone on back into the, very, very dim, distant past where we have these kinds of documents available. And so this is one of the more important ones because it will often give her maiden name. If it doesn't, it'll be witnessed by someone, and you'll say, well, who are these witnesses? Well, one of the witnesses, or both, may be her brothers or her uncles. Another one, her family, by looking at who signed these deeds. Another one is that if you're going back through the chain of title, you may see where there was an inheritance and you had these executors and administrators deeds, but because the wife inherited the property at some point in time, that information is recorded in the chain of title when she signs the declaimer deed. Property by wife deeded over to, as disclaimed her interest that she received through inheritance from her father so-and-so. And so this is, very specific type of information that can be found. And in some cases, we found whole family groups outlined in the deeds. Because they'll give some piece of property, they'll do it all in one deed, so everybody is named in the deed. And so you get a whole bunch of other important facts out of this chain of title. Now, what other kind of records are you going to get? The first ones, obviously, that are related directly to real property are tax records. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that you can sometimes go to the tax record and find out which property they own, but on the other hand, you can go, as you're going back in the chain of title, you may see references to taxes. For instance, if the person didn't pay their taxes, the government at the time, whoever was the jurisdiction, may have filed a tax lien against the property and recorded that lien. Now, we refer to the word recording. When I first started practicing law years ago, right in the beginning of law school, I started doing work as a clerk, as a law clerk for various law firms. The very first time I had a law firm, they handed me a stack of documents and they said, we want you to go down to court and file these. Well, okay, I said, sure. Got in my car and I thought, what am I supposed to do? I have no idea what they mean by file these documents. Where do I go? What do I do? I don't know. I'll go down to court and see if I can figure it out. So I drove down to the court and I went in and I said, I need to file some documents. They said, get in that line. So I got in the line and I got up to the front of the line and I said, I need to file the documents. And she said, well, where are they? I said, right here. She said, grab them from me and started stamping them. And I said, okay, but then what do I have to do? She said, you just filed the documents. You don't do anything. Do you want copies? Oh, I see you have copies. So then she stamped the copies and gave me the copies back. Okay, well that was it. Well, recording is the same thing. When we talk about recording a document, all we're talking about is handing a copy, usually the original, to whichever agency is recording the document. So a recording, usually there's county recorder. They may have some other, designation or name, but that's the same function as the person that you go to and hand all these deeds to and all of these property transactions to, and they stamp them in and make them part of the public record. So that's where we're going to get these documents. So the tax records are extremely important. Second are school records. If you don't know where these people lived, it's pretty hard to figure out what school district to start looking in. If you think about school districts, they're very local. And the school records may be kept locally, but they may have ended up in state archives. And you don't want to be going through 300 different school districts in a state trying to find your ancestors' school records. So finding their real property helps you to identify those records. Church records are the same way. People generally went to the church in their town or in their area. The more specific you are, the more likely you are to identify which of the churches they belong to. Voting registration records. If you don't know where they lived, how are you going to tell which John Smith on the voting record was your person? And so there's lots of other information that you can get from knowing where this person lived. Court records. Very important to know which jurisdiction they lived in. Probate records, same thing. Marriage records. Now, marriage records are a little bit different because the marriage records, they may be able to give you, most people got married in the area where they lived, the county or the place where the nearest justice of the peace or whoever it was that did the marriages, or the church. But in some cases, they went someplace else to get married. We do that. There's a term for that we call Greta Green. A Greta Green is a place where people go to get married when they want to get married outside of the area where they live for any reason whatsoever that may happen. Where do people go here in this district? They go to Las Vegas. Okay, that's a Greta Green. Niagara Falls. But interestingly, if you start researching that term in those places, if you've never been able to find any evidence of the marriage, you just may want to start looking from where they lived and where people usually went to get married. And those records are available. And so if you lived in Missouri, there's a place where they all went to get married. And that's that kind of thing only comes about once you have really located where this person lived. Knowing that they lived in Ohio is not going to help you. But knowing exactly which ranch or farm they lived on in Ohio maybe is the key to what all this. Now, what happens when we talk about this? What happens when and if the courthouse burns down? Monday night, when I started helping this patron with the question of his family in Tennessee, even before I said anything else to him, he said to me, well, my sister's been doing all this research, and she said the courthouse burned down. And I said, so, what is that supposed to mean to me? What am I supposed to do with that? And he said, well, we're not going to have any records. Well, this person that he was looking for was born in the late 1800s, and they already had records of him in the 1940 and 1930 census. And I said, I don't think the census records burned up in your courthouse. And we can start with that and lots of other records that weren't in the courthouse. But here's the real question. Here's the real question you ask when someone says that. I didn't say this to him on Monday, but I would obviously say this to anybody who wasn't being realistic. Did your ancestors have to pay property taxes after the courthouse burned down? Are you going to tell me that everybody in that county lived tax-free for the rest of their lives because the courthouse burned? How long do you think it took the county to reconstruct the land records sufficiently to send out tax notices? especially if the courthouse burned down, because they need money to build a new courthouse. Okay, now why is that the case? Why is it important to understand that? Well, with regards to property records, I mentioned title companies and abstracting companies. Well, ever since property has been exchanged or sold for hundreds of years, there have been third-party private individuals who have, for profit, kept track of all the landing transactions. So you have people who, for their own purposes, have kept track of all the land. In the United States, it's institutional. We have abstracting companies and title companies, and they have their own records. They do not rely on the access. They rely on the recordings, but they don't rely on maintaining, that the government's going to maintain those records, because they would like to have them accessible. Usually, the government only has a grantor grantee. In other words, they'll only index it on the buyer and the seller. They might want to know all sorts of things. They may want to index it by property. They might want to index it by all sorts of ways to find the property, the land more efficiently. And so these title plants, as they're called in the West, are vast record sources for all of the transactions. I've almost never come across a genealogist who wanted to part with a little bit of money and go find out what the chain of title was on his ancestral property, so he'd know all of this information about his ancestors. But you can just go to these people and pay a few dollars, $100 or a couple $100 sometimes, and get a record of every single transaction with copies of the original documents all the way back to when it came out of the royalty. So these are some things that we need to know about. Okay, now we're going to go into legal descriptions. There are four major categories of legal descriptions. The first one's called a perimeter description. We call them metes and bounds. What's happened with these primarily is that we have different terms used by historians, genealogists, used by surveyors, used by real estate people, used by attorneys. All of them have their own jargon. So what we call metes and bounds really doesn't have that, the term isn't used as the way that surveyors would use it or someone else would use it. So we're going to go through quite a few different types of descriptions. Strip descriptions are like roads. Roads are usually described by a strip description or an easement, which is a permission to cross or use a piece of property. Area descriptions by maps or plats, and that's like subdivisions. And the last one we already covered in another presentation, and that was public land survey system. Okay, this is the bounds. This is what you'll find in many of the really old deeds. If you go back into the 15 and 1600s and find a deed for property, you'll see that it says something like the land bounded by Hogan's Woods on the north, owned by Clint Brown on the east, to the south, recorded, and to the west by a road or river or something. This is where you can get really you don't know what to do with it, because how do you have any idea where this property is? I mean, as far as generally speaking. And this is why it's very important to begin with the present and work your way back, rather than try jumping into the 1600s to locate property. Now, it's very possible that there were maps back then that show the property owners. They give you an idea, way to start. So the first thing you would do would be to research it on maps. Second is a metes. Now the metes part of the metes and bounds is, the bounds is the first part. That's the boundary of the property. What is around the property? What's the edge of the property? The metes is the measurement. It's the directions and the distances. So as they go through it and say, in this case, they start and they go north 100 feet, east 100 feet, south 100 feet, and then back to west, back to the what they call point of beginning. Now, you'll notice there's a little yellow dot out there in the middle of nowhere. That little yellow dot is the beginning point. That's the monument. That's the point at which this particular measurement survey began. And that's the trick. That's finding that point is the big problem with identifying these properties. Now, the good news is that as time has passed, more and more of these properties have been surveyed. And they've been brought to modern surveys. And that's why I say, as we come into the present, we know that they own this farm, then we can move back and do title searches back to find out exactly how they got it and all the information that's available from those deeds and records. When I started doing this with the property owned by my ancestors in Rhode Island, who, as I mentioned, got there in the late 1600s, I got stopped here at the BYU library when I got into the records and found over 50 deeds. And so I basically said, I think I already know enough about the property and these people. But I really, at some point, am going to have to get back into and look at all of those dozens and dozens of deeds that are out there. This is the strip. Now, what they're talking about here is an easement or a roadway or access route, whatever you want to call it. An easement is a word that means if I have a piece of property and you buy a property away, I'm on the road, you buy a property behind me, and you say, well, I need to get across your property to get to the road, that's called an easement. If I give you a right to travel across my property. So what we see out here on the roads that are set out in these towns all across the country is that we have recorded easements for those roads. They have official ownership right to build a road of a certain width across people's property. So even if you own the property underneath an easement, you still can't stop the person from using that property. Okay, and the easement starts with the starting point, and then it simply measures a center line with a distance on either side of the center line. So you'll get a description like that. This is the lot and block. This is subdivisions. In fact, we're actually going to talk about these in another class. But essentially here what happens is they draw a little map showing where they would like to have the property. Let's start back at the beginning. Developer comes in, buys a piece of property, decides that they want to resell the property, so they divide it up into lots, draw a little map where everybody lives, is supposed to live, and where all the lots are, and then they hand that to an engineer. The engineer turns it into a scale drawing on the property. They determine a place to start their scale drawing. They hand it to another engineer who goes out, or surveyor, and he goes out and marks where all these roads and lots are supposed to be, and then they go in and start the development. Now, we may think that that's a modern process, but if some of you have ancestors who came across on the Mayflower in 1620 from England, you may have been told repeatedly that they left England because of religious persecution, and that they were all these religious people who came over to America because of their wanting religious freedom. That was probably true of half the people. The rest of them came over because they wanted to buy land. And the good news was that they got here, and the bad news was that most of them died the first year. And the second bad news was they landed in the wrong place, and they didn't have any title or right to the property where they landed. They thought they were in Virginia, and they weren't. They were in a place called Plymouth. And the Plymouth land owners in England, where they had to go back to England and negotiate a new contract with these new people because that's where they'd ended up. Okay, so from the very first step off of the boats into the New World from Europe, they came here because of land, and they had land issues and ownership and title problems. And if you extend that across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast, you will find that almost everything having to do with American history has to do with land sales. At the back of all of this vast panorama of history in the United States, we basically have a bunch of land developers. In Ohio, all the way across the United States, all the way across the plains, the United States government selling land, everybody sold land. Okay. Next we have the public land survey that they call sectionalized descriptions. And that they are descriptions like the southwest quarter or the northwest quarter or the north half of the whatever. And this is, we already talked about this. This is the one we would normally call, or normally have the title on meets and bounds. And we would say, starting at the point where the Dairy Road crosses Old Time River, we go south to the oak tree, east to the elm tree, northerly to back to the river, follow the river back to the starting point. Okay, this is not a lot helpful. Why? The river moves, the road changes, the trees get cut down, and where does all this go? Well, you have to understand, and this is another example of the fact that as time passes, they had to do surveys. When they tried to sell this property, the new buyer would come in and they'd say, well, where's the oak tree? And they'd say, well, it was right here. Well, great, I'm taking your word for it, good. How do I know the neighbor doesn't think it's someplace else? And they go, well, let's get somebody in here to survey it. And then we'll figure out where it is. So that's, eventually all these properties were surveyed. It's only when you go back in time, back to isolated deed, that the property then becomes a problem. Okay, next point. Descriptions by calls. First of all, the beginning point is hard to determine. Secondly, the monuments and corner markers may have disappeared or changed. Rivers, fences, roads all moved. Okay. Now, another way of dividing up property was a deed that said something like this. I give the east half, the east part of my property on the east part of the road to my daughter, and I give the west part of the property on the west part of the road to my son. So then, who owns the property if they move the road? Well, these are all things that have created things over time. And this one is very common, and it's very common today. I will sell off 50 feet of my property for whatever reason to someone, and I will say, then my deed will go on and say, lot such and such except for the east or west 50 feet of the property. Now, what happens in this case is that when they start selling these properties over time, and as people take smaller chunks or annex other pieces of property or put two pieces together, the deeds start to get longer and longer. And years ago when I started practicing law, one of the first things I had to do, because I became involved in land cases almost immediately, was to sit down and read these long deeds. And I can remember sitting there looking at a deed that was 2 and 3 pages long and starting at the end and going, what would happen? For example, one case I had near Winslow, Arizona, the piece of property, they gave me the deed. It was very complex like that. So many feet here, so many feet there. It went on for about 2 pages of single-space type. And when I finally got to the end, I could not get the property line to go back to the origin. In other words, the terminology we use is it didn't close. So the description went around the perimeter of the property, but didn't get back to the beginning of the property and left a gap. Well, I went through that about 4 or 5 times, trying to figure out where I'd made the mistake, and finally came to the conclusion that it did not close. I called my client and I said, you gave me this property because you're selling it, and your legal description doesn't close. Well, he knew what that meant. And he went, anyway, so got kind of upset about the whole thing. But we really did have to go figure out how to resolve that. And in many cases, they would end up in court before people would agree as to where the boundary was supposed to be. And this kind of thing, and trying to determine exactly where the boundaries were, after a survey, before a survey, because they had a legal description that was deficient or wasn't clear enough, basically kept me in business for almost 40 years. So that's what I did for 40 years. The last 2 cases that I had a year or so ago before I retired completely were both land cases, and both dealt with ownership. And that one was a boundary case, one was a homeowners association case. And they had been going on for years, and the one case that had been the longest was over 15 years old. They've been fighting over the same piece of property for 15 years. Okay, proportional conveyance, they'll say, I give you the north half of my lot, and I give the south half to your sister. So that's one way. Descriptions by exception show the property and then say, I give you all of the property, I convey all of the property north and east of the river, and the rest I don't own. Except for the property to the east of the river, the west of the river. Okay, the other way to do it is by acreage and say, I give you 5 acres of the northwest, in the northwest pasture, I give you 5 acres. And then you have absolutely no idea where that property is, and neither does the person who gets it, by the way, unless they happen to walk the boundary or think they know where it is. Now, how do we talk about property? This compass with degrees is kind of the key here. You'll see that all of the directions, the east-west line, all the directions above that are north, all the directions below that are south, all the directions to the right of the north-south line are east, and all the directions to the left are west. So if you have something that sounds confusing like north 20 degrees west, what that means is it's on the north half of the compass, and it's west 20 degrees. So the direction, the second direction tells you which half, the vertical half you're in, as opposed to the horizontal half you're in. So the opposite of that would be south 20 degrees east. And so that's the description. And you'll find these descriptions very common. Now those numbers are all even, but it can be anything. It could be 51.5 degrees or 51 degrees, 10 seconds, 10 minutes and 13 seconds east or whatever. So they can get pretty complicated. Now, sometimes they leave out the numbers. And in this case, what you've got is using the word by. So up there it says north by west would be the NX. The X is by. So you have north by west, and then you have north by northwest, and that's where they get the title of the movie by Alfred Hitchcock. So we've got northwest by north, northwest, and so forth. Now those are just approximate, and that's where we get into difficulty in getting the exact boundary. But the saving thing here is we don't have to know the exact boundary. We just have to know exactly where the property was, not the exact measurements of the property. That's not important to us. We're not going to court about it. Now here's a sample of a meets and bounds. This is in the handout, but it's also here in the description. I got this out of the deeds that I was looking at in Hopkinton, Washington County, Rhode Island. for the Tanners, and the town clerk in this case was one of my uncles. Then, this is an updated example, and in this case, you've got, this is in South Kingston, Rhode Island, and the key here is how do we translate this into something we can see on the map. And so we're going to take this one, and it's chosen for a lot of reasons. First of all, because I could find it, and secondly, because it's really simple. It's a rectangle. So we're going to get back to the beginning. So there's no problem with looking at the shape. If there were like 100 curves and all sorts of corners and things, it would be very difficult. But this is pretty straightforward. So how do we find out where these people lived? Well, we have to find the starting point. And the starting point, we can go to a map, and that's the first thing we should do, is go look and see if we can find this, generally some of these features on a map. And then we can go to directories. We think of directories like phone books as being modern again, but directories really go back to the clear back to medieval times. They have town directories. So it's sometimes possible to find your person's address or the actual location of where they lived, or even from the case of that one, there were a couple of neighbors, so you know if he's between this neighbor and this neighbor, then you know, you start to begin to understand where these people live. And then U.S. Census records. Often you can get the address or the pretty close to the location by looking at the enumerator maps and the addresses. There are what are called cadastral maps. Those are maps created for tax purposes, and they also go back, way back in time. Tax rolls will sometimes give you more information about the location of the property. School, church, fraternal organization records, deeds, all of that helps. Okay, so what I did was I used the map, and the first thing that happened is I found West Allenton Road in South Kingston, Rhode Island. And then I needed to go a little bit further and figure out what the address was. Well, since I knew who I was looking for, so I knew who was supposedly owned the property, then I was able to find them and find their address. So then I came up with the address. I switched this over to a satellite view out of Google Maps to show the road. Found out it was very short. Now there's a couple of things you can look at and start to tell about this property. This road is straight and has a bunch of houses on both sides. And it goes over here to an intersection where there's a commercial establishment. And the answer is, and this one here, it says it's Highway 1, back east. So these roads have been here for hundreds of years. So it's going to be easy to find these roads on maps in the old days. Highway 1, anybody live in the east and know about Highway 1? Goes all the way from Florida up to Maine. And if you would like a very, very long ride, Highway 1.
It used to be the only way.
Yeah, it used to be it, but yeah, there are probably 5,000, conservatively speaking, 5,000 stop signs and stoplights on Highway 1.
In each state.
Anyway, I also note over here there's a freeway, and I always tell people when I pull this up, I say, wow, it's neat. Your family only lived a mile from the freeway. And they go, oh. Some of them go along, they don't get it. But you can see here, this is subdivision. Okay, somebody decided to be artistic and draw a big loop out there and create a subdivision, put all the houses around it, which means that all of this property up here was owned by one person and conveyed later to all these people. So if we go back in time, we're going to find the original landowner, and then we'll find how all these people acquired this property and who they were, and probably find a whole family groups and all sorts of things in here. Okay, So now what are we gonna do? Well, we did find the address. So the address is 155 Allenton Road, and this is the property right there. And so we've located the property, but now we need to find the starting point. Well, the starting point is the edge of the road on the northwest part of the property. Now, the map was upside down because north was south on that map view. But here's the road. You can see the edge of the road right here. And if we went over here, there's the edge of the road. So right there is the X, is where the start point was. Now, do we need to know exactly within a foot or 2 inches? No, we're not selling the property. All we need to know is the outline and who lived there and where they were.
Is the start point mentioned in deeds or anything like that?
Yeah, if you look, it's on your handout, but we'll go back real quick and it says, beginning at a point on the northerly line of West Ellington Road, which is located at the southwest corner of the land of John C. Northwood. Okay, so basically, since we've identified the parcel, we know the next door neighbor, and we know that that's the property point where we're starting. Okay, now, one advantage of using Google Maps is I can click on that starting point and it will automatically give me the geographic coordinates. And this is in decimal coordinates rather than northeast by northwest and all that sort of stuff. It's basically a 360-degree circle, and it's 1.1111 up to 6 decimal points, and then 2, and then 3, and so forth. So they're very exact. And that's showing you exactly where that piece of property is. Now comes the little bit of the tricky part, and that is we're going to use a program called Plat Plotter. We're going to put in the survey start, which is the decimal coordinates up at the top, and we're going to put in the legal description in sort of a modified form. We're going to put it back into the simple. They're saying northerly direction, so many feet, southerly direction. So we're going to say north, so many feet, so many degrees, and then so much distance, west, and then a distance, so forth. So we're going to put it into a little diagram, and there's what the diagram looks like when you get that all in there. Now the numbers, the directions were not in the deed. So how do I know which numbers to put in? That's because I fiddled with the program back and forth until I got the lines to match up with the property boundaries that were there. How do I know there were property boundaries? Well, if we go back to that picture of the thing, you'll see here that this guy has mowed his lawn right up to that point. So what's the boundary? Or the fence line, or whatever. So you can look at the satellite and the street view, and you can see exactly where this guy never cuts his lawn, this guy cuts it, every day, this kind of thing. So you can see each of the boundaries of the property. Some places it's a little vague, but we're not looking to be exact. Okay, now once we have that information in, we simply enter the survey and the program draws the boundaries on the map. Then if we want to extend that another little further, we can take that Google Maps drawing, we can export what's called a KML file from the program, and it will draw that same boundary with the coordinates at each of the corners onto Google Earth. So now we have a visual of where that property was. We know how far back it goes. It matches, by the way, if you look at it, you'll see the rear boundary matches with a fence line that's on the back of the other two properties and so forth. So you can see that that's probably was all sold in regular lots when it was sold out. Okay, well that gives us back to we're back to the beginning where we say, now we can start doing all of that research that I've talked about, of finding the neighbors, identifying the records that would be associated with this particular piece of property. We could do a title search, go back and find out, since we can figure out pretty quickly who owns the property today, then we can go back and keep going back until we find our people and how they, when they own this piece of property. Now, how do we know? What are some of the things that can help us to find out where somebody lived if we just have some kind of vague description? Well, one of the most common ones was that if they buried their people on the property, which they did frequently, and there's going to be a cemetery. If you were in Rhode Island, and this is how we found the original Tanner's property in Rhode Island, was there's a survey was done in Rhode Island and identified every known cemetery and gave them a number. And there's a book published of all the registered cemeteries in Rhode Island. So there's the Tanner Cemetery registered with the geographic coordinates of where it was. Well, that's easy until you try to get there. And it turned out that this one was in the middle of a country club.
Oh, dear.
And it was in an undeveloped part of the country club, and my wife still has the scars showing what it took to go through the bushes and the blackberry bushes to get to the cemetery.
Growing up on Long Island, there's a famous country club called the Creek Club where the Duke and Duchess of Windsor golf, and we would caddy there. And there was a section of wooded area like you're talking about. And when we got in there as kids once, we found 17 gravestones, and it was clearly a cemetery, but it was part of the country club now.
Yeah.
So it's just exactly like that.
Well, I always thought it was kind of significant that the Tanners ended up on a country club. No. But anyway, so that's it. Thank you.